All right, so today we're diving deep into managed instance groups on Google Cloud. MIGs, as I guess some people call them.
The cool kids.
Yeah, the cool kids. And we're looking at some documentation about basic scenarios for using these. So I guess for someone who's maybe like completely new to this, what are we even talking about?
So imagine you have a bunch of virtual machines on Google Cloud. You could think of them like little computers you rent in the cloud,
Here
right?
we go.
A managed instance group, or a MIG, is like it's like grouping these VMs, these virtual machines, and treating them as one unit.
Okay, so instead of like individually managing a whole bunch of different computers, I can kind of put them all together in this group and manage the group as like almost like it was its own computer, kind of.
Exactly. It's about making your life easier when you're dealing with multiple VMs in the cloud.
Got it. So the documentation lays out different scenarios. We've got single zone, multi-zone deployments, even scaling from a single VM. Then there's auto scaling using preemptible VMs. Oh, and even deploying those GPU heavy workloads, which I'm always interested in. So where should we even begin with all this? What's going to be the most, I don't know, useful starting point?
Well, I think before we get into the weeds of each scenario, it's important to understand why you'd even use a MIG in the first place. Like, when would you choose a multi-zone deployment over a single zone?
Yeah, good point.
It's all about fault tolerance. Let's say your app is running in one zone and that zone has a hiccup. Goes down.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, not good. Your
No.
application goes down with it, right? But a multi-zone MIG, that spreads those VMs out. So even if one zone has issues, your application keeps humming along.
Ah, so it's like a safety net.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Especially for like critical applications, you don't
Right.
want any downtime. Now, I'm also seeing something here about stateful MIGs. What are those all about? Those sound kind of interesting.
Stateful MIGs are cool because they solve this big challenge in cloud computing, um, data persistence. See, normally when a VM restarts or gets replaced, any data you had stored locally on that machine, well, it's gone.
Right.
Stateful MIGs, they change that. They keep that state, that information, even if the VM itself changes.
Oh, okay. So it's like having, I don't know, like a backup of your computer's hard drive that's constantly updated.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I'm running something like a database and a VM in my MIG decides to take a break, this stateful configuration makes sure I don't lose all that critical data.
Exactly. It makes them perfect for applications like databases, file servers, anything where that data, that state is absolutely essential.
Got it. So stateful MIGs, they're like the reliable ones, the ones you can depend on. But I'm seeing in the documentation that there are some limitations, especially when you combine them with regional deployments. Like, what's up with that? What do people need to know before they like go all in on stateful regional MIGs?
Yeah, you got to be careful there. Stateful regional MIGs are powerful, but they have nuances, like proactive redistribution, for example.
Proactive redistribution. That sounds intense. What is that?
So imagine you've got your stateful instances spread across different zones in your region. Proactive redistribution, it's like a balancing act. It tries to make sure each zone has a similar number of instances up and running.
Mm.
Makes things run smoother.
Okay, and that sounds like good so far. So where does the be careful part come in?
The thing is, if it's not set up just right, it might accidentally delete those stateful instances. You got to be really sure you've got it configured correctly.
Ah, okay. So powerful, but you got to know what you're doing. It's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Exactly. The documentation also mentions limits on using auto-scaling with stateful MIGs, and it emphasizes using specific replacement methods for updates.
Interesting. So those limitations, they're there for a reason. They're not just being difficult.
Right. It all comes back to protecting that data, that state.
Yeah.
You don't want to be in a situation where an automatic process accidentally wipes something crucial.
Makes sense. Now, what about these default limits on the number of VMs in a MIG? I'm imagining someone out there is thinking, okay, that's cool, but what if I need like a ton of VMs? What happens then?
Well, they can always ask for more. Google Cloud lets you request increases to those limits. You can do it through their console or just reach out to their support.
Okay, so there's like room to grow. You're not stuck with that initial limit.
Exactly.
All right, good to know. Now, I'm also seeing something here about target distribution shape for regional MIGs. That sounds like a mouthful. What is that all about?
So with a regional MIG, remember you're spreading your VMs across multiple zones, right?
Right, for that extra safety net.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Target distribution shape, it's like it gives you more control over how those VMs are spread out.
Okay, so instead of it just being like an even split between all the zones in that region, I can
Mhm.
actually like fine-tune it.
Exactly. You can say, hey, I want more VMs in this zone and maybe fewer in that one.
And why would I do that? What's the advantage of, like, messing with that distribution?
Think about it. Maybe you've got a primary data center in one zone.
Okay. Right.
You want to keep your compute resources close to that data to minimize latency, make things faster. Target distribution shape lets you do that.
Ah, so I can optimize for performance, make sure things are running as smoothly as possible.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of optimization, we can't forget about those preemptible VMs. Those seem like a good way to save some money.
Right, like a flash sale on VMs.
But they're also a bit, they could disappear.
Yeah, they're like those amazing deals you find, but you got to be quick because they might not last.
Exactly. So how does that even work with MIGs?
So you can create a MIG that uses these preemptible VMs. Now, if some of those VMs get preempted, the MIG automatically tries to replace them with new preemptible ones.
Okay, so it's like having a system that's constantly looking for those flash sales for me. That's pretty cool.
Right. It takes care of the bargain hunting for you.
Love it. Now, we've talked about a lot of different things here. Single zone, multi-zone, stateful MIGs. Even those preemptible VMs, for someone who's maybe hearing about all this for the first time, is probably a lot to take in. What are some key things they should keep in mind as they're, like, starting out with MIGs?
Don't overthink it. Start with the basics. What does your application actually need? Does it need to be up and running all the time? Can it handle a little bit of interruption? How important is that data? The state.
Right, so it's like, what are the non-negotiables? And then you kind of build from there.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to just try things out. Create a test project, experiment, see how different MIG setups behave.
Hands-on experience is always the best, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, now before we wrap things up here, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, fault tolerance. We talked about how, spreading things across zones can help if one zone goes down, but what about a whole region? Could that happen? Like, what if an entire region goes dark? What's the solution then? I mean, that's like a whole other level of worry, right? A whole region going down.
It's definitely something to consider, especially for those mission-critical applications. It's not super common, but regions can experience outages. And that's when you start looking at multi-regional deployments.
Multi-regional. So we're talking about going even bigger, not just multiple zones, but multiple regions.
Yep. Think of it like having a backup system in a totally different part of the world. One region goes down, no problem. Your app just switches over to the other one. Keeps running, no interruption.
Okay, that's next level planning right there. But I'm guessing it's not as simple as just like flipping a switch. There's got to be more to it, right?
Oh yeah, multi-regional deployments are definitely more complex. You got to think about keeping your data in sync across those regions, latency for users in different locations, even legal stuff about where that data is stored.
So like every layer of resilience we add, it gets exponentially more complex.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But for applications where downtime is absolutely not an option, like every second counts, it's worth it.
Yeah.
That peace of mind is invaluable.
Makes sense. So it all comes down to figuring out your specific needs, your risk tolerance, and then choosing the approach that makes the most sense for your situation.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today, haven't we? Single zone, multi-zone, stateful, even dipped our toes into preemptible VMs, GPUs, and the whole multi-regional deployment thing. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we sign off?
I think the biggest thing is don't be afraid to experiment. Spin up a test environment. Play around with different MIG settings. See how they work with your applications. You'll learn a lot more by doing than by just reading about it.
Love it. Get your hands dirty, right?
Okay. Well, on that note, that's a wrap for today's deep dive into managed instance groups. Hopefully you learned something new. We'll catch you next time for another exciting exploration into the world of cloud computing.